Baruch Hashem, you're a bad Jew.
Shalom.
Well, would you look at that? For those who are on YouTube, not on the listening platforms, you're looking at Jerusalem, the Kotel. There's the Dome of the Rock, and there's a whole gathering of people there, a lot more than normal. Ephy, what is going on down there?
Hi, Chaz. Great to see you. There's a swearing-in ceremony for a new set of recruits joining the IDF. And to make it more meaningful and idealistic, so they often do it at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. And we actually have some students who are down there and swearing in as we speak. So we may hear some announcements and even some trumpets over the course of the podcast.
That's incredible. We've never had a podcast open that way before. Now you're saying that you currently have students at the Aish HaTorah Yeshiva that you're at right now swearing in as well, meaning that you're going to have someone that's simultaneously a student and also a recruit of the IDF. Is that what I understand?
No, like an alumnus, a couple of alumni who graduated our program and now are joining the IDF.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Wow. And so for those who are listening, if you haven't caught our drift yet, Rabbi Ephy Greene is at Aish HaTorah, the international location. They're based in Jerusalem. And what is your role at the Aish HaTorah Yeshiva?
So I am officially I'm director of admissions. I like to call myself the doorman. You know, I let people in the door. Try not to get me too many people out of the door. But I organize all of the interviews and admissions processing. I also get the opportunity to teach a lot, and I love hanging out with the students and getting to know them and helping them develop their Jewish identities and their growth. And it's a great time over here.
That's amazing. And by the way, for those who are listening, if you are listening to this episode now, there's a high chance that I'm currently being taught by Rabbi Ephy Greene or one of his colleagues over there in Israel as we speak. I'm going to Yeshiva starting July 22nd, going till August 13th. And I'm really excited. So again, thank you again, Rabbi Greene, for having me in your studies and for taking me into this new and exciting opportunity. But in the meantime, we have a podcast to get to. We have the right of entry under the podcast, which is the 4-minute Bad Jew Challenge, where you tell your life story in 4 minutes. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Excellent. Echad, shtayim, shalosh, yalla.
Okay, here we go. Ephy Greene was born in Connecticut. I grew up in a couple of small towns there until I was about 7, and I moved to St. Louis, Missouri. We moved a couple of times because my father was a rabbi growing up. He was a rabbi in conservative synagogues. And sometimes the rabbis have to go where the work is. And so I grew up kind of like on the borderline between, let's say, the conservative world and modern Orthodox world, kind of davening my dad's shul, being involved in USY, conservative youth group, but going to an Orthodox school because it had more options for me at the time. And always kind of like straddling those two worlds a little bit, getting to know different Jews and different backgrounds and learning from them in different ways, experiencing with them in different ways. I formed a very nice relationship with a rabbi of mine in high school who learned with me on the weekends, and a few other guys. We used to eat donuts and listen to him talk Talmud while we waited to go to basketball practice. And it impacted me, and I was inspired to go to Israel for 2 years after high school. I studied in a yeshiva also here in the old city called Yeshiva Kotel, an Israeli yeshiva with an American program. Afterwards, I went to Yeshiva University to get my bachelor's in psychology, continued there to get my rabbinic ordination and a master's degree in Jewish education. And near the end of that stint, I met my wonderful wife, Bracha, and we went to Israel and started our marriage with a year in Israel, studying and growing and connecting to the land over here. We went back to the States for about 7 years, so my wife could finish her degree, so I could get some work experience. I was teaching in some of the modern Orthodox elementary and high schools. And then about 16 years ago, we made Aliyah, moved to Israel to fulfill our life's dream. We had 3 kids at the time. And, it was an adventure. And so I found a nice job teaching in some local yeshivas. I live in the Beit Shemesh area, which is like a nice suburban neighborhood outside of Jerusalem, and working in Jerusalem. And it was great. About 9 years ago, I came over to Aish HaTorah, and it changed my life. The environment here, the style of teaching, the openness to all different types of students, and the inspiration, which is so unique. So basically changed my teaching style, changed a lot of my life perspectives about how to approach Judaism, how to approach being a rabbi. It impacted my kids' lives in a beautiful way, sharing them the inspiration And today, after a number of years working in both the modern Orthodox post-high school program that we have here, as well as the Foundations program, which is for beginners to Judaism, as well as the Beit Midrash for the advanced program, teaching in all the different programs, as well as our recently opened seminary, I'm just having a great time teaching a lot of Torah, thank God, which I really enjoy, and helping people grow. And as director of admissions, I get to meet great guys like you and hopefully bring them in into our programs.
Well, I'm absolutely honored. Thank you for nailing that 4-minute Badger challenge with 30 seconds left on the clock. That was very well done. And awesome. I'm curious, do you still eat donuts and study Torah?
I do study Torah. It's hard to get donuts in Israel, unless it's Hanukkah time.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's like just not popular, because they have lots of other good nash like rugelach and stuff like that. So
yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Also, once you hit 40, like for some reason your metabolism just totally slows down, and like the donuts just stay, and you start to look like a donut. So like I'm trying to avoid them.
Sure. No, I totally get that. Well, I appreciate that you're studying Torah and also studying your health as well. And I as someone who believes in my health, I very much resonate with that. However, I do expect when I get to Israel that we get to share a donut together. That would be really great.
Okay, well, we'll find some good nash. Yeah.
Sounds good. So, Rabbi Greene, the subject of today's episode is addressing something that a lot of secular Jews feel, okay? And that is that, God, if you do believe in God and you're more on the secular side, then you understand that God is this benevolent being, for lack of a better term. It's literally universal. So why would this universal space-filling asset, for lack of a better term, okay? Why would this thing that completely controls us actually need us to pray? Because prayer is just it's a tiny little thing. It doesn't really seem like it's important to God, to Hashem. Why would he want us to pray?
Okay, so it is a big question. It's a question that a lot of people ask, and it's a question that not only secular people ask. Religious people also ask themselves sometimes, like, what am I doing over here? And what do these words mean? And why did I have to say it like this? And what's the point? What's the purpose? So, if we take a step back, and again, kind of like you said, like, presuming that somebody believes in God, believes in an all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite force that runs the universe. So just logically, it doesn't make sense to say that infinite force needs anything. By definition, an infinite power doesn't need praise, doesn't have self-esteem issues, doesn't have anxiety, doesn't have depression. It doesn't need somebody to say, "Oh, you're good, you're nice, you're merciful." So God doesn't really need anything. So if that's the case, then we're stuck with the question of so then why are we doing it? So by definition, that infinite power, not needing anything, if you think about it, just kind of provides us with these opportunities to connect to him, for lack of a better term, to be able to connect to God and that infinite force. And prayer is probably the most primary way that we can do that. Fascinatingly, the term for prayer in Hebrew, lehit palel, is in the reflexive form, which means it's really about reflecting on ourselves and a little bit, not just connecting to God, but really connecting to the godliness inside of ourselves, so that we are, in touch with something about ourselves. Many people struggle with prayer. Many people go through different experiences in life, challenges, and they pray and they don't feel like they got an answer. So they might say, it's very easy to kind of turn aside and say, you know what, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in prayer. But the truth is that, if you think about it, this idea of prayer being an opportunity for us to connect with God, connect with that infinite power, is really kind of like a relationship. And people, we like to say over here in Aish, Judaism is not a religion; it's a relationship. And we're trying to have a relationship with God and engage with that infinite power. But relationships are funny, and if you think about it, your listeners, I'm sure, understand this from their own dating or marriage lives. That a relationship, ironically, depends on the one who wants it the least. Just think about it. If you ever ask somebody out and they're like, "No, I'm not interested in you," right? So it doesn't work like the way the movies, make it look like, oh, but here's flowers or here's some chocolate candies. Like now you'll fall in love with me. It doesn't really work like that. If the person's not interested, they're not interested. So the relationship, what level the relationship is going to be at, it depends on at least. So if we apply that to our relationship with God, so who wants the relationship least? So again, believing that God is all powerful and benevolent, like you said. So God didn't have to create us. He didn't need anything, like we said, but he chose, for his own reasons to create us. He chose to wake us up this morning, to give us another shot at life, to give us another opportunity to engage with him, to engage with the world. So there's something that he wants, from us in a certain sense, or he wants for us. And, it seems to be that relationship, God is like all in, because otherwise we just wouldn't be here. But the fact that relationship might be struggling or things like that is really on us. So it's really about, how much do we want that relationship? We are the ones who want that relationship least with this relationship with God. And therefore, sometimes, if we think about well, how do I engage with that relationship? How do I connect to him through prayer? So sometimes it's not so much that we feel like it didn't work because we don't believe in God, but maybe it's because we don't believe in ourselves. We don't believe that we are worthy of the creator of the universe, of an all-powerful being wanting a relationship with us. But if we could go into the prayer experience with more confidence and with more aspiration for connection, and with confidence that the other side of this relationship wants that connection, so then it could really propel us to a much greater and more profound prayer experience.
It's super interesting. And I hear on multiple levels here. So there's a lot to digest. But the main difference that I'm picking up here, humans might not want all the time to pray, but God doesn't necessarily need us either. So there's this dichotomy between wanting and needing. And it's the humans that apparently need and don't want. And it's God that doesn't need but wants. Is that an accurate statement?
I think that's a fascinating but accurate description. Yeah, I think that's true. Right, God has no need of us, like we said, but yet he desires, again, not like in a human desire kind of a way, but in a benevolent desire. He wants for us to be able to connect to his perfection, to his ultimate and infinite power. For us, it's the trick is like saying, okay, I'm willing to do the work. I'm willing to put in the focus, the concentration, the understanding of the terminology and the structure of prayer and things like that will make prayer a meaningful experience. Many of us are just lazy. Many of us, might or may not be so turned on by the prayers that we've been exposed to. But prayer doesn't have to be like that formal experience. Stand up on page 412. Please rise. Please be seated. It doesn't have to be like that. Prayer is meant to have a certain spontaneous, personal component to it. Our great rabbis of from the ages, from some of these books behind me, they write about how a Jew can pray to turn to God at any time, and you're about to miss the bus or finally for an apartment, or for an appointment, or you just want your technology to work properly. You can throw a prayer heavenward and bring God into that real life experience. That's real prayer. That's real prayer. And the more a person makes God a part of their life, the richer that relationship is.
Okay. I get that. Totally makes sense. I mean, if I'm drawing a parallel to when you're in a relationship, right? You're talking about connecting God to everything. That's the same way that you get a framed picture of your loved one, you put it on your desk while you're at work, or you have your loved one as your lock screen on your phone, right? 100%. You're carrying that with you everywhere you go. Yeah. So, okay, we're talking about the we're talking about the metaphorical lock screen of being able to carry Hashem with you wherever you go, and that relationship that you carry with you.
Right.
What is the stark difference then between those that pray and those that don't pray? Going at it from the more practical human sense here.
Right.
Because again, we don't necessarily want to, but apparently we might need to.
Right.
So what happens there?
Well, you know what it is? I like to compare it to like, again, a relationship. Let's say, Mother's Day. Mother's Day comes around, and if you're a good kid, you run over somewhere and you pick up a nice gift and you bring it to your mom and you give her a hug and wish her happy Mother's Day. Or at least you send her a text or something. The relationship is there. Like you could skip out on Mother's Day. You might feel a little guilty. Your mom might not think you have enough gratitude to her, but the relationship is there. However, when you do invest in it and you go out and you buy a nice picture frame or bring her over a cake or whatever it is, like the relationship is richer. So, those who pray are investing in that relationship. They're focusing on it. Those who don't are not focused on it. The relationship is there, but they're not building that relationship in a proactive way.
Got it. Okay. So how do you know if you should have that relationship in your life then?
So, I mean, that's a deeper question in terms of like, a person's general outlook towards God and towards religion. Most people in life, I believe, are searching for meaning. There are definitely non-religious and non-Jewish and non-religious books that have been written. Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning, and plenty of books out there that people are looking for a higher sense of morality or a higher sense of purpose in life. And as man searches for that, so I mean, this is a long conversation, but like a person can, through logic, be brought to a belief, a conviction that there is a God who exists, who cares for us, and wants to see us successful and positive, and doesn't give us really not only prayer but any of the mitzvahs, any of these commandments, because he has like some sort of self-esteem issue. He needs us to serve him. He doesn't need that. All of the mitzvahs are really for us. All of them are God's way of helping us develop a lifestyle and a sense of being, in our lives that is enriched with morality, with meaning, with a deeper sense of purpose.
Fascinating. Okay. No, that all makes sense. I'll leave it there because I understand that that's a can of worms that could be its own episode for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
But let me ask this though, because you mentioned this very briefly earlier, and I want to touch up on it. You mentioned formal prayer versus informal prayer. And so formal prayer, like you mentioned, flip the page 412 and stand up and sit down and rise and sit at certain points, right? Is there a pro and con to formal prayer? And is there a pro and con to informal prayer? And what would you define as informal?
Sure. So, I mean, informal, like I said, is anything spontaneous. Like prayer in a certain sense is us opening up ourselves to God, feeling vulnerable, feeling needy, and allowing our sense of self-driven success to kind of like take a sidestep and recognize like we're not all powerful. There is an all powerful being out there that's really directing the world, and I'm willing to subjugate myself to his will because I believe in that power. So again, I'm running late for the bus. Please God, let me make that bus. I don't know. I'd love a date with that girl. Please God, make it happen. Different needs, that we're expressing along the course of our, daily lives. Informal prayer expresses that a lot, brings God in, enriches that relationship. Formal prayer is there for a few reasons. The Torah, to a certain degree, mandates, having some degree of prayer, but informal prayer would be enough. But the rabbis instituted a more formal structure with the text that we have in the prayer book and with specific times, because it creates a certain energy, a certain formality, for that relationship, so that we don't overlook it. We're all busy people. We all have agendas. We need to make a living, and we want to relax, and we want to have relationships. And when are we going to focus in on the spiritual? So the rabbis instituted specific times. We try to pray in the morning, afternoon, and night. They gave us the language of the prayer book as not really as a mandated text, which is like inviolable, but it's like an outline. It's really meant to be kind of like themes that are important to the individual, important to, on a national communal level, and it's based very much on the words of the prophets. So we're almost like speaking back to God in His own language, by using the prophet's words to express our own needs. God, please give me wisdom. God, please give me health. Please give me success. Take care of the nation. Have everyone be safe. Take care of Jerusalem and the Jewish national capital. And it's the rabbis, I think, were trying to hit on all the themes that are important, again, to the individual and to the community, and make sure that we took we have the responsibility to infuse the spiritual into those components, and not to kind of think like, well, the national status of where our people are at is all dependent on politicians. No, there's a spiritual side also. If we're in the hands of the politicians, we'd be in big trouble.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense, though, because what you're saying is just like a relationship. Again, let's draw back to your partner, right? Your partner who you have a picture of in your lock screen, who you have a framed photo on your desk, right? In all actuality, you need structure around a relationship in order to keep it. And as someone who has been in a few relationships and has, tried, I can tell you that when we had, I can tell you that the most successful relationships were the ones where we knew that we were going to have a date night and we were going to have, exclusive time with just us and also a time with friends and family, right? So that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me in terms of like creating a structure, literally echoing the words back to God that He had given us through the prophets, right? Does informal prayer come in other forms as well? And you talked about spontaneous prayer, like a quick bracha for, let's say, the water that you're drinking or the fruit that you're eating, which has literally happened on the air. One of the last guests did a bracha over the fruit during the interview. I was like, oh, okay. Informal prayer, right? But could prayer also come in the form of meditation or some kind of active service, or has prayer come into the picture in a less verbal way than what we think prayer is typically?
It's an interesting question. I think prayer, in its classical definition, it's definitely, the rabbis call prayer service of the heart, which comes from the concept that, a lot of the structure behind our prayers come from the temple service, the sacrifices that were brought in the temple, in the first and second temple period, the timing, the morning, the afternoon, all these kinds of things. Once the temple was destroyed and there was a need for a I guess an alternative, a way of connecting to God. So the rabbis formalized prayer. Prayer did exist before, but it was definitely much more spontaneous and much more personal. Our forefathers prayed. The Torah talks about Abraham praying, Isaac and Jacob. But once it was formalized after the destruction of the temple, so that's when we had our specific times and the specific language and things like that. But the term that the rabbis used for it is like the service of the heart. And what that implies, and this is I think so crucial is for people to understand, is that even in the formal prayer, the primary ingredient is the heart, is that God wants to hear from us. He wants us to feel an emotional connection, a spiritual connection. And that's something that doesn't necessarily come easy. It does require a certain amount of meditation or a certain amount of, just to walk in off the street into the synagogue and like say, okay, I'm going to smack down some prayer over here, and it's going to be meaningful and powerful. It's a little naive, we are not always spiritual by nature. We live in a world which balances a lot of different components to it: physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological. And to be able to focus in on prayer definitely requires some meditation. I think spontaneous prayer, not everyone would call it prayer, but any sort of personal improvement, volunteering for the community, service in general, which is geared towards what we like to call tikkun olam, or fixing the world. So it's, in a certain sense, you're turning your whole life in a certain sense into a prayer, into an offering to God. And the truth is, I'm just thinking of this now, but King David actually says this in the Psalms. He says that va'ani tefillah, I am a prayer. And somebody at King David's lofty level, maybe can live in an existence where every action is some sort of expression of like, I'm yours, God. I'm vulnerable. I'm needy. I'm an agent of yours, and trying to bring out the good and the positive and the holy and the spiritual within my daily life. But yeah, that's a pretty high level to be at.
For sure. So this is all amazing. This is all great. But I have an important question that really, I think, will either make or break this conversation. And that is, how do we actually know that God wants this?
I think the fact that, listen, how do we know God wants anything? You know what I mean? Like, all we can work off of is what he has communicated to us. And, the Torah itself, again, for believing Jews, and, we actually teach courses here in Aish that give evidence that the Torah is, was written by God. There's logical evidence. So the Torah itself, it is God's communication to humankind, him expressing his will, his vision for life. If we take it back to a relationship parable. So, I sometimes tell the students, about imagine a story of like a couple who are in love and they're planning to get married, and then all of a sudden there's a terrible accident, and one of the partners can't speak, and has a very hard time expressing, their emotions and their plans and their vision for the relationship. So, the best that they can do is they write a letter, a love letter, which is 25 pages long, 50 pages long, 100 pages long, spelling out the whole vision that we're going to live together, and this is what I'm going to do for a job, and this is how we're going to run carpool and pick up dry cleaning, and this is how this is how we can build a life together. I love you, you love me. This ability to not be able to speak is not going to be a handicap, because you can know exactly what's in my head and in my vision and in my heart, and we can still have a meaningful relationship. And God wrote us that love letter. The Torah itself is that love letter, where God said, this is my vision for the world. This is my vision for how humanity can live a more moral and profound lifestyle. And, when the Torah says that, you should serve me with your heart. So the rabbi said, what else could that mean but prayer? What does it mean to serve with your heart? Like to serve in the temple is like, okay, like offer up some sacrifices, whatever. That's a whole nother discussion as to why that would be meaningful. But what does it mean to offer God my heart? So prayer is that form by which a human being whose unique character trait in all of creation is the ability to speak, is offering their heart, is offering their essence to God by speaking to God, by using that ability to articulate their emotions, their feelings, their visions, their aspirations, and offer that up to God. And so therefore, it's evident from the Torah that God is saying, I want to hear from you. I want you to share with me what's in your heart, and that will solidify our relationship.
Understood. That makes sense. You write a love letter to commemorate just how powerfully you feel. So we're not just little playthings. We're not just little toys that this benevolent being created to control and be put on this earth. We're actually, sorry, we hear some music in the background from the calling event. No, it's beautiful. It's awesome. Hey, you know what? This music will help accompany the message I'm trying to say. It's a love it. Well, if we're gonna connect it to the what's the service called again? The IDF service that's happening right now.
It's called a swearing-in ceremony.
The swearing-in ceremony. So if we're going to connect this to the swearing-in ceremony, right? I suppose we could say that, the IDF is the equivalent of, I don't know, is that true? Is that the IDF could be like the equivalent of this universal, all-powerful being that we call God, in this case, symbolically? In each soldier's service is the prayer that we're describing here? That they themselves...
I guess. You can use it as a parable.
I'm trying to create some kind of parable here, because like everything happens for a reason. There's a reason. Right. There's a reason this is happening. So
I I think we can say like this. I'm a rabbi, so this is like this is my job to like this is your idea. So, like a soldier in the army, is dressed like everybody else. They all have the same uniform. They all have to salute. They have to stand at attention exactly like everyone else. So you'd think, okay, these guys are not human beings. Like these guys, it's a bunch of robots, who they've been trained and they have to march in order, and they're all standing with the salute right now with the trumpet. But every individual soldier there has something deep in his heart. And there's going to be some unique difference in terms of how this soldier performs versus that soldier performs. This one's going to be scared and maybe chicken out. This one's going to be brave and fight to the end, hopefully the end with the enemies. And he's, and inside of that heart, what they offer up is their service to the country. That is, that is the greatest thing that they can offer. Their bravery, their aspiration for peace and for security for the nation. So every Jew also is in a certain sense a soldier in God's army. And we have our marching orders. We're supposed to be a role model for humanity, of moral society, and of living positively and sharing good values. But every individual is going to depend on how emotionally and spiritually they connect to God through their prayers and things like that. So, I think that what's inside the heart, that service of the heart, is again, it's something which is manifest in the army, and it's something which is manifest in our relationship with God, and it's something which is manifest, in our individual lives as well. Again, going back to relationships, you can be deeply in love with a partner, but if you never say "I love you," so then something's missing. So there needs to be an expression of what's in the heart, and prayer is really what gives us that expression in our relationship with God.
Amazing. I think it's a fantastic way to summarize the points and to kind of help me even understand. I've always had my personal reasons why I've done prayer, but I don't think I could ever formally articulate it the way that you have on the show. So thank you for doing that for me, for validating those ideas that I've implemented into my life. And also for, being open to a wide range of questions, from skeptical questions to the emotional questions that I've asked. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Effie, for those who are listening, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
The best way to connect with me is you can send me an email, egreene@aish.com. Green has an E at the end. So it's like the color green with an E at the beginning and E at the end. At aish.com. Aish is Yeshiva and educational institution here in Jerusalem. And happy to answer questions, happy to talk about various programs. If you're in Jerusalem and you just want a great view of the Western Wall, pop on by, and I'd be happy to meet as many Jews as possible. Like I said, I'm the doorman, and happy to meet you guys and welcome you to Jerusalem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Effie. To listeners, thank you so much for tuning into Bad Jew, the place where there is no such thing as a bad Jew. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and any of your favorite listening platforms. Be sure to subscribe, leave a comment on our social media, follow us there. Also, if you are interested in our merchandise, go to badjew.co, where you can get the Mazel Tov t-shirt, Hebrew coffee, and so much more. We'll see you next Wednesday on Bad Jew.
Shalom.